still remember the day the invitation arrived. It was a crisp Tuesday morning, the kind that makes the sunlight sharper and the shadows longer, as if the world itself is holding its breath. I was in the kitchen, my hands wet with dish soap, drying the last of the breakfast plates when the phone rang. It was him, my son, or at least the boy I once knew, before ambition and the bright glitter of a city life seemed to reshape him into someone unrecognizable. He said, voice clipped, polished, the kind of tone that always made me brace for something I didn't yet understand. "Why don't you come to dinner tonight? I'd love for you to meet some friends. You'll fit right in." I froze for a moment, my heart tightening. Fit right in. The words felt off, a polite veneer hiding an edge I couldn't quite place. My first reaction was joy. My son wanted me there, wanted me part of his world, even if only for a night. But something in the cadence, the almost imperceptible pause before he said, "Fit right in," stirred a knot in my stomach. For years, I had devoted myself to raising him. There were sleepless nights, working extra shifts, tightening every belt, sacrificing meals, comfort, even moments of pride so he could grow, excel, and find the life I dreamed for him. And yet lately, his visits had become brief, distant. His smiles polite but hollow, his laughter shared more with others than with me. Where once he had clung to my hand, now he seemed to distance himself, as if my modesty, my plain clothes, and my gentle ways were obstacles to the man he wanted to become. I accepted the invitation, of course. My instinct was to embrace him, to show warmth, to step into the world he had created. I cleaned the small apartment I'd lived in for decades, choosing a simple blouse that I hoped reflected my self-respect without drawing attention to my plainness. The walk to his apartment was long, giving me ample time to wonder if I was imagining the tension I sensed. Was it just a mother's insecurity, or had something truly changed in my son? Arriving at his building, I paused in the lobby, taking in the polished marble floors, the glossy elevators, and the scent of expensive perfume lingering in the air. I clutched my small handbag tightly, suddenly aware of the contrast between my shoes, scuffed from everyday life, and the polished heels of the women who passed me with faint smiles. I reminded myself to breathe. This was my son's world, yes, but I was his mother. I belonged here, even if they didn't see it yet. When he opened the door, the transformation I had feared was undeniable. My boy, now a young man with the posture of someone accustomed to being admired, greeted me with a warm hug that at first felt real. But I noticed the flicker in his eyes, the quick glance to the others gathered in the room, the tiny smirk that vanished when he met mine. The laughter in the apartment was lively, but it felt performative, rehearsed. They were waiting, I realized with a sinking heart, for some sort of entertainment. The first few moments were polite. Drinks were poured, introductions made, and I smiled, my voice calm, my manners intact. But the veiled jabs began almost immediately. "Oh, Mom, is that your vintage dress?" one of his friends asked, laughter tittering around the circle. "It's so classic." A compliment with a sting, coated in mockery, and my son laughed, not in discomfort, but with the same light cruelty I had feared. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and hurt. My heart thumped painfully as I kept my composure, letting my lips curve into a small smile, letting my eyes shine with the warmth I had cultivated through years of love, patience, and sacrifice. Each veiled remark was a test, each chuckle a trap. I sensed the intent. This was not a casual dinner. It was a stage, and I was the unspoken subject of ridicule. I could feel my pulse quicken, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me falter. Inwardly, I began to analyze, to strategize. There was power in restraint, in observation, in patience. I remembered the countless nights I had guided him through homework, dried tears, comforted fears, and now I realized that those lessons were my secret arsenal. I would not confront the mockery directly, not yet. Instead, I would let it unfold, let the tension rise, and watch the situation with quiet intent. As the conversation progressed, the jokes grew bolder. "Mom, how do you manage with so little?" one friend asked with a smile that was far too wide. "Everything here is so luxurious. You must have had some interesting habits growing up." My son laughed, a sound that was warm yet edged with something I had never heard before, approval of the embarrassment, as if my discomfort was a performance worthy of applause. I forced a deep breath, reminding myself that appearances can be deceiving. There was no shame in modesty, there was no weakness in humility. I answered lightly, with grace, sharing small anecdotes from our home, painting pictures of dinners made from ingenuity, of quiet moments of joy, of love that money could never buy. I could see some of them falter, small glances exchanged, faint shifts in posture. The contrast between their opulence and my lived reality became sharper in that room with every word I spoke. Inside, I felt a simmering mix of anger and amusement. The anger was natural, the betrayal of my own son cutting through me like ice. But the amusement came from the realization that I was not powerless. I had endured far more, sacrificed far more, and the core of who I was could not be diminished by their laughter. I began to allow subtle humor, playful comments that mirrored their snide tones, but without malice. Each carefully measured word was a step in a dance I had begun to lead. Time seemed to stretch, moments lingering like the suspense in a tautly drawn bowstring. My son continued his performance, oblivious to the storm gathering beneath my calm surface. I could see him testing the limits, seeing if I would break, seeing if the quiet mother he once knew could be humiliated before this circle of polished friends. But I remained composed, letting each jab pass with an air of serene dignity. The contrast was becoming clearer. Strength masked in humility, resilience hidden in simplicity, and a quiet intelligence that could outmaneuver arrogance. By the time dessert arrived, I had made a decision. I would play along, not as a passive participant, not as someone to be mocked, but with intent, with purpose. Every smile, every nod, every casual remark would be a thread woven into a tapestry that would reflect not weakness, but strategy, not submission, but moral strength. I would let them think they had the upper hand, all while preparing the subtle maneuvers that would turn this dinner into an emotional lesson for the son who had once clung to my hand, the boy who now sought to belittle the woman who had given him everything. And so, as they raised their glasses for a toast, laughter spilling like fine wine across the table, I lifted mine with the same warmth and grace I had cultivated over decades. Inside, I was calm, my mind alert, my heart steady. The stage was set, the players in position, and the first act of the evening, this intricate ballet of humiliation and subtle reclamation, had begun. I would play along, but on my terms. I would reclaim respect, teach lessons without anger, and let the contrasts of humility and arrogance, loyalty and betrayal, innocence and manipulation unfold naturally before everyone at the table. The night had only just begun, but I already knew one thing. This dinner would not end the way they expected. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, feeling the swirl of tension in the room tighten like a drawn bowstring. Every smile around the table seemed sharper, every laugh more pointed. My son's eyes flickered toward me, a mix of expectation and mischief. He was waiting for me to falter, to reveal the embarrassment he so clearly relished. But I had made a quiet decision hours ago. I would play along, but not as a victim. I would transform this dinner into a subtle dance of wit, grace, and moral clarity. The first move was simple. I leaned back in my chair, adopting an exaggeratedly polite posture, and smiled warmly at one of his friends. "Oh, you must forgive me," I said with a playful tilt of my head. "I've been so used to our quiet dinners that I might spill something fancy across the table." My voice carried a teasing lilt, a gentle mockery of their expectation that I would be daunted by their opulence. There was a slight pause, just enough for a ripple of awkward laughter. I noticed my son stiffen, the first crack in the confident facade he had built so carefully. Encouraged, I continued. Each joke was self-deprecating yet clever, highlighting my simplicity without shame, allowing them to assume they were at the center of the humor. "Back home, we call a corkscrew a fancy opener," I added lightly, pretending to examine my glass. "I hope I'm using it right, wouldn't want to ruin such a delicate evening." The room tensed. Some of the guests exchanged glances, uncertain whether to laugh or admire. My son's grin wavered, a small tremor betraying his growing frustration. As conversation shifted to work, vacations, and weekend plans, I allowed myself to weave small observations that hinted at insight without confrontation. "It's incredible how the little things in life, like a sunny balcony or a quiet cup of tea, can mean so much," I said, glancing at my son. "Sometimes, I think it's the unnoticed moments that define us most, rather than the grand displays." My tone was warm, almost casual, but the message carried weight. He shifted uncomfortably, sensing the unspoken implication. Humility, thoughtfulness, and quiet strength are not weaknesses. I noticed subtle shifts among the guests. A friend raised an eyebrow, a smirk fatting into genuine intrigue. Another, attempting a pointed remark about my modest upbringing, faltered mid-sentence when I matched her tone with gentle amusement. Each response was deliberate, calibrated to maintain dignity while revealing the shallow arrogance of those who sought to mock me. I began to feel the tide turning. What had started as a stage for ridicule was becoming a mirror, reflecting the absurdity of pride cloaked in laughter. My son, increasingly restless, tried to regain control. "Mom, you're being too modest," he said, his voice betraying both irritation and incredulity. "This is a dinner, not a performance." I smiled softly, meeting his eyes directly, my expression calm. "Sometimes a little performance helps everyone see the truth," I replied lightly. The subtlety of the remark struck him. His lips tightened, and I could almost hear the cogs turning in his mind. He wanted to win this battle of appearances, but I had already shifted the rules. The tension thickened further when one of his friends commented on a piece of art in his apartment, saying, "It's impressive, though I suppose taste is learned." Without missing a beat, I leaned in, eyes twinkling, and said, "Oh, I've learned a lot from observing." Sometimes the most expensive things aren't the most meaningful, wouldn't you agree? The statement was innocuous on the surface, but the subtle implication hung in the air. Heads turned, murmurs spread. Even my son paused, caught between laughter and a rising sense of unease. I felt a quiet satisfaction building, not from revenge, but from a sense of moral victory. Each turn of phrase, each carefully measured smile highlighted contrasts that were impossible to ignore. Humility against pride, insight against superficiality, restraint against cruelty. I was no longer playing the part of the simple, powerless mother. They were playing the part of the audience to my quiet lessons. The balance of power had shifted, imperceptibly at first, but unmistakably now. Then came the moment of climax. My son, in an attempt to reclaim the upper hand, made a remark so pointed I could feel it sting immediately. "You know, Mom," he said, leaning slightly forward, "it must have been difficult for you raising me on so little. I mean, some of us are lucky enough to have everything handed to us." Laughter bubbled around the table, and for a split second I saw the satisfaction in his eyes, the cruelty laid bare. I paused, letting the words linger. My heart pounded, but my voice remained steady. "Yes, it was difficult," I said softly, looking around the table. "But sometimes the challenges we face teach us lessons that money can't buy, lessons in patience, resilience, and love. And isn't it interesting," I continued, a faint smile curving my lips, "how those who think they have everything to give sometimes have the most to learn?" The room fell silent. Some guests shifted in their seats, the tension palpable. My son's jaw tightened. I could see the realization dawning slowly, like sunlight creeping through clouds. I let the silence stretch, giving weight to the words, allowing the contrast to sink in fully. Arrogance versus integrity, mockery versus wisdom, superficial pride versus lived experience. The air felt heavy, charged with the subtle electricity of revelation. My son's gaze dropped to his hands. I sensed the first stirrings of introspection, perhaps even shame. But I didn't push further. Moral lessons delivered in calm dignity are far more lasting than any forceful confrontation. Dinner concluded with small talk, but the energy had irrevocably shifted. The guests who had arrived expecting amusement from my supposed simplicity now looked at me differently. Curiosity replacing condescension, respect edging into admiration. My son, once the orchestrator of mockery, sat quietly, caught between embarrassment and a dawning understanding. I could see it in his eyes, the beginning of a reckoning. The first acknowledgement that humility and integrity hold power in ways ostentation never can. As I prepared to leave, I felt a quiet glow of empowerment. I had navigated the evening with grace, humor, and subtle intelligence. No harsh words had been exchanged, no anger had flared, and yet the lesson had been imparted. My son had been confronted, not with shame or rage, but with calm truth, mirrored in my composure and strength. The contrasts had been clear for all to see. The power of character versus the emptiness of arrogance, the dignity of restraint against the fragility of pride. We embraced briefly at the door, a gesture warm yet layered with unspoken acknowledgement. "Thank you for coming, Mom," he said quietly. There was a tremor in his voice, a vulnerability that had been absent earlier. I smiled, squeezing his hand gently. "Always," I replied. "Always." Walking back through the streets to my small apartment, I reflected on the evening. It had been more than a dinner. It had been a quiet battle, a moral chess match played with words, demeanor, and observation. I had preserved my dignity, imparted lessons without anger, and reclaimed respect through composure and insight. The contrasts had been stark, the tension profound, and yet the resolution was elegant, human, and emotionally satisfying. In that still night, I realized something deeper. Life is not about proving others wrong with force, but about embodying strength in the quietest ways. The true power lies not in mockery or wealth, but in grace, humility, and the courage to remain steadfast in one's values. And sometimes, the most important lessons are learned not through punishment, but through the gentle, unshakable demonstration of integrity. By the time I reached my door, I felt complete. The evening had begun as a test of patience and resolve, a stage for mockery, and had ended as a quiet triumph of wisdom, love, and moral clarity. I stepped inside, closed the door gently, and let myself breathe. The night had been long, tense, and fraught with emotion, but I had played my part, and the lesson had been quietly, undeniably delivered.